Hey, welcome back, Faithful Politics listeners and watchers. I am your political host, Will Wright, and I'm joined by your faithful host, Pastor Josh Bertram. How's it going, Josh?
Doing well. Thanks, Will.
And today we have with us Dr. Matthew Boedy. He is a professor of rhetoric and composition at the University of North Georgia and a leading voice analyzing the intersection of religion, politics, and extremism in America. He's got a book that's coming out, The Seven Mountains Mandate, exposing the dangerous plan to Christianize America and destroy democracy. Boedy also uncovers how a fringe but growing theological movement seeks to gain control over key areas of cultural influence to establish a Christian theocracy in the U.S. And this audience is no stranger to the Seven Mountain Mandate, and we're just so glad to have you on the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for inviting me. I'm happy to talk about it.
I do have to ask, like, is there a requirement for all people that study the Seven Mountains Mandate to be called Matthew?
There might be. I have, if you count my extended family, I have 7 Matthews. I'm the first number 1. So, is a common name, but some people spell it with one T, but they're just wrong.
Do you all have a favorite gospel?
I prefer John, but that's just
really. I would have thought Matthew. Thanks.
No, the Logos thing, man, with the red.
Got it.
Come on, somebody.
Yeah. So why did you write a book about the Seven Mountain Mandate? Now, give us kind of the backstory.
I started writing about the subject of the book, Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA, back in 2018. And when he converted, if you will, to Christian nationalism, I recognized it right away, his language that he was using and what he was talking about, because I've grown up hearing that in different ways. So when he talked about the 7 areas of cultural influence, I looked, wait a minute, I've heard that before. So the Seven Mountains thing was sort of a bigger theme to his organization, and he's pushed that. And so writing about Charlie Kirk and then pushing the Christian nationalism, that just fell right into my lane. And so that's why I decided to write a book about
it. So before you hearing Charlie Kirk use that kind of like language, like had you ever really kind of thought that much about, Christian nationalism or kind of the influences that it has on our modern day politics?
Oh, certainly, man. I grew up evangelical, so I've heard things like this from, we'll just say, the political conservatives out there, and it's been named different things over the years. I understood what he was saying because I understood terms like theocracy, and dominionism and things like that. I personally had not heard of the Seven Mountains until it came into being in, if you will, in 2016, 2017. But the idea of this thing, I've known for a while. So that's what I kind of say when I heard what he was saying, I knew what he was saying. I knew where it was coming from. So I have a long history with it.
How did you react when you first heard him talking about it, using this kind of familiar language? And why do you feel like, when we think about cultural engagement from Christians, I've heard this defended in a lot of ways. People are overreacting. It's really about, Christian influence in the sense that, people are going to they're going to share Christ with others. They're going to get into these different areas and basically be salt, like leaven, right? Working through the dough and being underground, sharing faith. And then the more people that know Jesus, or the more people that have genuine experience and authentic faith, then that's going to affect. And so that's kind of how I've heard it talked about, but it seems like there's something else going on here, that's much more nefarious. Yeah. So kind of explain that to us. What's the distinction here?
I think for me, I will say came of age in my 20s in the 2000s, where we have a lot of talk about VeggieTales and Christian movies and parallel entertainment, if you will, to Hollywood. And they wanted to create something that would balance that out, or you could choose the Christian area and not do the other thing. And I bring that up because what is happening with the Seven Mountains Mandate to me is not creating a Christian alternative to all the other 7 areas. it is about taking back those 7 areas. So we think about influencing the culture, whether that's politically or religiously or media and entertainment. We're talking about trying to perhaps make things more Christian, and perhaps, as you said, evangelize people in such a way as they would become Christian and they would influence people. But the Seven Mountains Mandate is a minority movement. They're not interested, or at least we'll say their top goal is not evangelism. They don't want a mass movement of, we'll say, majority Christians. They're interested in Christians leading on top of those mountains. But what they're suggesting, of course, is that Christians should take these areas back, not by a majority of evangelism, but by institutional control. So this is why the 7 areas, or 7 different institutions, if you will, of our culture that they want to have. So when we say influencing the culture versus taking control of the culture, and I think there are moments in the history of the last 50 years where that has moved from one to the other. There are certainly, though, people who are still interested in influence and in the salt and light part of it. But I think what distinguishes the Seven Mountains Mandate is the idea that the church has not done enough to take back these cultures. So I mean, the last thing I will say is about the mountain of religion. The idea is that from the Seven Mountains Mandate is that the church has been taken over by Satan. That it's one of the 7 mountains. So how do you suggest that has happened? And their answer is that we have not done enough. We have not done our citizenship. We have not taken the church outside the 4 walls. So their idea is the church should be more than just doing gospel things.
You know what I really like about your book, and we've had Matthew Taylor on the show a number of times just to talk about the 7 Mountains and Andre Gagne and others. Each of them, I think, brings something to the conversation. And what I love about what your book brings to the conversation is it's like you really spell out those mountains. I mean, your chapters are basically the mountain of education, the mountain of government, mountain of religion, so on and so forth. So like, I'd love for you to maybe give us an example. You'd already kind of used a little bit of the religion mountain, but give us kind of an example of where we see this type of influence, from each of these mountains, in, I don't know, today's news or environment.
Sure. I think that the mountain of education is really a good example of that. So we have in our country a history of private schools and Christian schools and doing their own thing and not taking federal funding, for example, and creating their own schools. So, around the time that vouchers started becoming bigger, it was initially about allowing a few poor schools or students that weren't being served to take some money and go to private schools. But now the vouchers are allowing students who've never been to a public school, who've never set foot in there, who've never saw its badness, to take state money and go to vouchers. And I think that this is a 2-pronged attack on the mountain of education. One is to defund public schools, but then 2, you think, okay, they're just going to defund it, they're going to end it. But no, they also then want to fill that void with things like the 1776 Commission from President Trump's first term and more patriotic education. They want to put back into the public school curriculum things that they want, some Christian, some patriotic things, and not just give money to private schools. So when I say retake the mountain of education, it is not just taking your kids out of public school because they're secular and they're bad. It is also going back in there and suggesting we need to remake them from the ground up. And vouchers are a huge part of that. But also part of that is the book discussion, we'll say book bans or book debate, the curriculum in terms of K through 12 and what state legislators want to do and what you can't say and can say. But also it is about divisive concepts, those laws that we have one here in Georgia about what you can teach and what you cannot teach. So there's a wide effort to go back into the public schools and to remake it in a Christian manner and also take money out of it to go fund private schools.
Oh, and I'm curious on your thoughts about the 7 Mountain Mandate, because I mean, personally, I think the labeling of it is a little deceptive, because a mandate, like, to me, just sounds different than like a war plan or attack plan, if that's what we're calling it now. Like it's different because everything that you're saying, it's like it's part of the plan, part of the strategy. We're going to do vouchers, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, and it has a lot of uh, remnants of like Project Blitz, like this, state by state, small laboratories
Right. Yeah.
of like, hey, let's see if we can, get 10 commandments on walls and license plates and stuff like that. So like, can you maybe just talk a little bit more about, is it like a mandate that all churches basically have to follow, or is it, something different? Like I was trying to explain it more like a battle plan. Like people are just, hey, they recognize what this is. Oh, we've got to conquer that one, that one, that one.
I mean,
yeah. So go ahead.
yeah, if you think about the early years of religious conservative action in politics, it was about influencing. And there were some titles of some books, like Bill Bright, the Campus Crusade guy. His book from the 80s is about spiritual war zones. And so we have this spiritual battle going on. And I think once we moved into, we'll say, Lance Wallnau version of the Seven Mountains, and he's the guy that came up with the metaphor, the spiritual warfare has been moved to spiritual victory. We can claim victory over these war zones. So when you think about mandate, it is a religious mandate from God, saying that the kingdom of God is here now. We just have to act on it. So the mandate is already there. It's already present. It's the thing that it is not about persuasion or influence or things like that. It is, of course, persuading Christians to act on it, but the mandate is already there. I think that makes the difference between, if you will, the Seven Mountains mandate today and previous versions of Christian nationalism before that. That some of the people, especially in the mountain of education, talk about retaking or claiming land or claiming territory. Like we should take them, we just have to take them. Or going to a school board and saying, I'm a Christian and you should pledge allegiance to God here. And if you don't, we're going to vote you out. That's sort of like, we already own this land, or we already own this territory, we already own this domain, we're just going to act upon it. I think that's the definition of the mandate. The idea that there are 7 areas that we should take back, and that God has told us to take them back because he wants to prepare America as a special nation. I think that is the idea. There are many different versions of America as a Christian nation throughout its history, both left and right. But this particular one suggests, of course, that we're both reclaiming our history and also suggesting that it is preparing a future that prepares America for Jesus' return. So the mandate is sort of a reading of different verses about the kingdom of God that is here now, and we just have to act upon it.
So, I think about Jesus, the passage in Matthew 28 where Jesus says, all dominion in heaven and on earth is given to me. Mm-hmm. And so essentially, and I even preach this, I would hear this where it's like, hey, when you go out there to make disciples, you essentially have authority to make disciples. Now, what that means, that's up for debate, interpretation. Yeah. I mean, I used to kind of think of it as some kind of like spiritual, like, I don't know. I don't want to say hocus pocus because that's not what I thought of it as, but like, hey, you're going to make this claim. You're going to go out there in boldness, and then this is going to happen because of your faith, because of what you're doing. And you use, which again, I'd have to look at that passage again, because like when I'm thinking about Jesus' dominion as a pastor, I never thought this means that we should take everything over and force people to be Christians. But I get this sense like this idea of reclaiming something, the language that that is being used, like what historical assumptions and narratives are being drawn upon in that, and like is it biblical? Are they going to biblical passages? Or is it just, hey, here are some prophets, here's what they said, here's just where this came from? Like what exactly are they reclaiming? Like what's going on with that?
Well, I think they're reclaiming the idea that colonial America, 1776, the founding of America, was a Christian founding. There's different things they cite about the founding fathers and Bible-believing Christians, and that our laws, our Constitution are based upon the Bible, and really bad history there. But also I think that there is this I want to use the phrase cultural consensus because I think it's a phrase that Francis Schaeffer used to use, and like that was his goal, that there was a Christian consensus. You're not necessarily forcing everybody to be Christian. You're not interested in discipleship or conversion, but you are interested in this, we'll say, overall consensus that we are a Christian nation, that our laws or culture and our institutions should reflect that. And so that could mean people in power making that so, but it does not mean a majority of the people in the nation are converted into Christianity. It certainly does not mean the same thing for other Christian religions. And I think so. It means taking us back to a history, but it also means, in some manners, seeing America as the prophets saw Israel in the Old Testament. And so one of the verses that Charlie Kirk quotes a lot is in Jeremiah, where he talks about the Israelites being exiled, and they were supposed to seek the prosperity of the place that they're in. I forget the chapter and verse, but it's in Jeremiah. He changes that to, we should demand the prosperity of the nation, and that when you seek the prosperity of the nation, your prosperity will go up. And he uses prosperity not so much in an economic sense there, but in a moral sense. So if you think about the idea of a nation, that America is a Christian nation, and I want to specifically add that it is not about, you mentioned the Matthew verse, right? The spiritual authority of Jesus to make disciples, that is focused on the individual, that you go out and convert individual people, perhaps at a mass event, but you convert individual people. The Seven Mountains mandate is an institutional, national mandate. It is not about converting individual people to go influence. It is about taking over institutions. So the idea of nations or nationhood or nation boundaries and what makes a nation, is it a Christian nation? Are there Christian principles? That very much is what they're going after.
The other thing I really enjoyed about your book, which is probably one of the first books I think I've read on Seven Mountain Mandate, Christian nationalism, adjacent type topics that really kind of dug more into the TPUSA Charlie Cook connection. I can only imagine, it's based on your prior writings and expertise, but I'd love for you just to maybe unpack that a little bit more, because I found that just really, really fascinating.
Well, if you don't know who Charlie Kirk is, he's the founder and president of Turning Point USA, which is described sometimes as a college group that he goes after college students and goes on campus and has these debate with them. And that's certainly true. It has expanded rapidly and widely since 2020 or 2019, which is around the time that he converted, I say, to Christian nationalism. He was not into this, in fact, was against it through 2012 when he founded Turning Point USA as a high school student out of Illinois up to about 2018, 2019, and he met Pastor Rob McCoy. So to suggest that he is now a Christian nationalist and he's using Turning Point to further that goal means that he has made Turning Point into the indispensable group for the Seven Mountains. He's put his millions of dollars into those 7 areas. So we have the college thing. They have more high school chapters now than they have college chapters. So that is the mountain of education, obviously. He has Turning Point Action, which is their political endorsement rally. They support candidates there. So that's obviously the mountain of government. They have a Turning Point News called Frontlines, which is their mountain of media. They have Benny Johnson, who is their chief meme officer, about the mountain of entertainment. And Turning Point USA Faith, which is the most important, I think, for your audience, which is their outreach, if you want to call it that, to churches and congregations and to pastors. And it's particularly to pastors. I went to a Turning Point USA Faith Pastors Summit 2 weeks ago here in Gainesville at a mega church called Free Chapel, led by Jensen Franklin, which is one of Trump's early evangelical advisories board members. And so that Turning Point Faith is about taking the politics back into the church. And one of their mottos that they repeated at that summit was, it's not political, it's biblical. And they very much don't want to make it a political thing. They want to say it's a Bible thing. And they talk about different issues that apply there, but they really want to connect with pastors and their congregates. And they have, if you think about Turning Point USA and the campus chapters that they have, like I said, they have many across the America. They have these same type of chapters in churches. So Turning Point USA is not just a college organization. It is not just Charlie Kirk on campus debating liberal students. It has grown into, I don't know what the the price tag is, but Turning Point USA itself is $100 million, and Turning Point Action is different. But they have money to burn, and they've been burning it in all 7 of these mountains.
That's pretty wild, and I'm curious if at some of these events, because we did interview a guy that he said he was BFFs with, Charlie Kirk, Bryce Eddy, and nice enough guy. Disagreed on a ton of stuff, but like he was kind of giving us sort of the insight of this TP USA Action thing they had shortly after he attended, and I'm curious, like, so they don't say it's political, it's biblical, which sounds a lot like what I've heard in other sermons and other folks that were like, I'm not going to tell you who to vote for.
Right.
But, like you should vote for the pro-life, pro-gun, pro-whatever, issue. Yeah. And then, of course, it's going to be like the Republican, right?
There's only one person that fits that.
Yeah. So like, is there other ways that they kind of use, subtle or clever language? Because I mean, I don't even know why they do this, because some sure just don't even like care, and they haven't really prosecuted a Johnson Amendment case in who knows how long.
Right.
So, yeah. So I'd love for you just maybe just unpack a little bit more about how folks were receiving that. You said it was at a church.
Yeah.
Probably with a bunch
the
of
church that they were at, Free Chapel's a charismatic. Jensen Franklin is in that regard. And so he's Charlie Kirk and Turning Point have been focusing their attention on that segment of Christianity. So they do have a lot of people in that area. And I think that one of the things they try to do is ignore the things that divide them. So they don't necessarily talk about end times and people that disagree on post-millennial versus pre-millennial. And they also want to talk about issues that unite them. So Lucas Miles is a pastor from Indiana. He is now the head of Turning Point USA Faith. And in his spiel, if you will, at the event that I went to, he had people recite the Apostles' Creed, which you think that happens every day in churches. And yet, while after that, he talked about different political issues that people who unite around the Apostles' Creed should also unite around. So when I say that they want churches to do more than the gospel, they're not just adding to the gospel, if you will, and adding to evangelism. They're suggesting the gospel includes all these other issues. So it's not really gospel plus, but they're suggesting that the gospel is a national political thing, not just an individual evangelistic thing. So when they talk about saving individuals, of course, and they also talk about saving nations. So they take this rhetoric that we all know and really believe in and easily, seamlessly translate it into a political discussion. So they go back to it's not politics, it's biblical. So now you're saying, oh, we don't have to get tagged with being political. We don't have to be tagged with being politically correct because we're just talking about the Bible. It's really a fascinating rhetorical thing that Charlie Kirk, and he does it well. He's really good at what he does, no doubt. And so I went to this event, the Pastor Summit. So the first night they had the house worship band at Free Chapel, and they were singing worship songs, and he comes out to talk and give his idea. And so it was just a seamless transition between worshiping God, talking about sin and righteousness, and praising things that he does, to talking specifically about things that are wrong in America and how Christians should stand up and fix those things. Who
led worship?
Just curious. The seamless thing was just amazing to me. And then, of course, the next couple of days had different speakers. They talked about digital media, and they talked about religious broadcasting, all the different areas that we've laid out here. And each night started with a worship service, a worship song. Yeah.
Who led worship?
The house. Do you remember? Chapel. I mean, they have well, I don't know, 12 campuses now, but the house band at Free Chapel.
I thought you were going to say Sean Fuchs or something like that.
Oh, well, no, he's done Turning Point USA events. He travels around, but I mean, Free Chapel has their own thing. So I mean,
right, they have their own.
They're the Hillsong of America. So whatever.
There you go. Yeah. So the 7 mountain mandate, right? It seems like it's intersecting and interacting, right, with all these secular movements, maybe even populist political trends. Like, how do you see it interacting with things like nationalism, authoritarianism? Like, how is it? Are they just buddies? Is it like nationalism and authoritarianism, or like their secular version of what they are trying, are feeling like they need to do with Christianity? What's the connection there?
I think that movements in Hungary and Russia, particularly, and again, I'm not an expert, but they use the church in similar ways to what is happening in America now. And the church is not just an arm of that movement; it is the soul, the spiritual power of their movement, even though it is totalitarian and autocratic, as you say. So Donald Trump comes along and recognizes the power of that, right? His first evangelical advisory board was filled with these charismatic, that is theological, not just personality-wise, leaders, because they were leading a movement that was named, the New Apostolic Reformation that Matthew Taylor talks about. And so he saw that he could use them. I'm not suggesting Donald Trump is a Christian, but he saw that he could use them for his own ends. And I think that's the relationship. They're allowing themselves to be used because he gives them what they want. We talk about Supreme Court justices, but it's way more broader than that. And they also allow him to operate with I don't know, I wouldn't call it a evangelical faith, but he talks in languages that they understand enough to see that he's with us, even though he's not one of us. And I think that that is the connection there. It is not necessarily a secular movement, but the autocratic and the totalitarian movements in Hungary and Russia have a religious aspect, or at least a cultural aspect of returning us to a purer culture or a better culture, or a culture that did not have these degenerates in them. And I'm kind of doing a Putin thing there, but that is in some manners what's happening in America.
How is like the Seven Mountain Mandate separate from Christian nationalism, or are they the same?
I call the mandate a sort of a strategy of Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism can be very much broader. It's an ideology. There's different ways of testing how far you're willing to go with it. But the Seven Mountain Mandate is a strategy to implement Christian nationalism. It is obviously these 7 areas, and how you do the 7 areas. Some groups have been doing 2 or 3 at a time. You think about the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025. That is one mountain. But there are other mountains. And so doing them all at the same time is, to me, what Turning Point and Charlie Kirk is doing. Throughout the history of the mandate movement, we'll just say it dates back to the 70s, they have been trying to do these different areas. Education and government come up a lot. And it started in the church, but these other areas have tried at different times. And so Charlie Kirk, I think when he converted to this and Rob McCoy convinced him that it was the thing to do, I think he saw it as a tremendous business opportunity. He certainly believes in it. I'm not suggesting it is not that. But at the same time, it is also a tremendous opportunity to expand Turning Point from its roots in education. So Christian nationalism is a strategy. It is a strategy Charlie Kirk is using. It is a strategy that he was taught by Lance Wallnau, who is he calls himself a futurist, a strategist, and that's what his job is to give us a vision of what could be, and people latch onto that.
Now, I want to talk a little bit about just like universally accepted terms for what you just described, because your book addresses Seven Mountain Mandate. We've heard the term New Apostolic Reformation. Mm-hmm. There's 7 spheres of influence. Yep. There's a lot of terms I know that our audience has probably heard on this particular subject. So, like, is the Seven Mountain Mandate that you're talking about the same as the New Apostolic Reformation? And then kind of follow-up question would be, if we had Charlie Kirk in the show, which you're more than welcome to come on if you're watching, and we asked him about this, like, would he be confused about the Seven Mountain Mandate, and that people are saying that's what he's doing?
He would deny that he was doing it. I'll start with your second question. He has said through his spokesperson that he cannot identify the 7 areas, which is kind of funny because, again, there are documents in planning and donor documents where he says we want to invest in these 7 areas. And famously, John said that President Trump is the first president to understand these 7 areas. So I think he recognizes the negative associations that we have with Christian nationalism and dominionism. So your first question was, is it similar or akin to the NAR? And yes, exactly. I mean, Peter Wagner, who created the NAR, was a advocate of this. He was convinced to be an advocate of it by people like Lance Wallnau and other people who kind of started it before that. And I want to say it's kind of, an iffy history, but then that's what I wanted to do in the book, is to trace out the history of these mountains and how they all came to be centered on or collected in Turning Point USA. So you think about Lance Wallnau and meeting Lauren Cunningham in 2000, who Lauren was the head of YWAM, Youth with a Mission. And he had this vision with Bill Bright about these 7 areas. And that 7 areas were not divinely inspired. They had come from other places. They're listed in textbooks. Abraham Kuyper across the pond in Europe came up with these spheres of influence. So it was out there, it was known, and they listed these for themselves. So it has a collection of history or links all the way back to Kuyper. But what Matthew Taylor pointed out is this network of apostles and prophets that Peter Wagner started, added to it by suggesting that there was this spiritual warfare that was going on and that we had already won. And I think that's what makes, I call Charlie Kirk the 3rd generation of it. So if Lance Wallnau and Peter Wagner are the 2nd generation and Bill Bright and Lauren Cunningham the 1st generation, there's a change from the 1st to the 3rd. And it's much more victory is ours, victory is already done, and also they've been losing ever since then. So Charlie Kirk has had to ratchet up the rhetoric about good and evil, about the end times, about every election being the end of the world, to get people to go along with him. That was not necessarily the case, or not as bad, if you will, in the 1st generation.
So that's so interesting to me, because you hit on this idea of eschatology, right? Theological jargon for end times, ideas of what's going to happen when the world comes to an end, when God essentially, stops, the world as it is and makes something else. And everyone, I guess, at some level has some kind of eschatology, and if they think about it, or, they don't know how the world is going to end, but everyone probably has an assumption it will end at some point, whether it's in billions of years and when there's heat death, or when, Jesus comes back and they think that's going to be next year.
Meteor in 2028 or whatever.
Yes. They're waiting for that meteor. And so the question I have is what role does eschatology play in this? How is it an engine that drives this? And how does it drive the motivations and what's going on?
Your metaphor is very correct there. It's the engine that drives this. So, I said I grew up evangelical. I every now and then caught Jack Van Ippy on TV. Are you familiar with Jack Van Ippy? He goes on TV, quotes the Bible a lot. He says, this is the end times. These are events that are happening in Revelations. They're happening now. And his wife's right next to him. And she's saying, oh my God, you're so correct. And Jack Van Ippy he died, pre-millennial, dispensationalist. This is the end of the world. And we know it's coming and we know it's here. And therefore we should evangelize people. And I bring that up because I wanted to contrast that with Charlie Kirk and what he's doing. Charlie Kirk does not talk about the end times a whole lot. I can't remember exactly, one time that he actually has. But what he is doing is both Jack Van Ippy saying the end of the world is coming and we should be motivated to act. And he mocks the people whom he says, oh, the end of the world is happening. We should do nothing. We should just, Christians should just let it happen. He says, no, you should act. But he is promoting, whether implicitly or explicitly at times, that idea that the end of the world is not going to be filled with tribulation for Christians. It's not going to be filled with attacks on Christians or the church, that it's going to be filled with victory for the church. This is, in some manners, the goal of the Seven Mountains Mandate when they retake all the 7 mountains. So the idea is that the end of the world is kind of, I would say the word iffy right there, but he doesn't want you to go either way. So at this pastor summit, he knows he's talking to a bunch of pastors who are pre-millennial, who are perhaps dispensationalists, but are definitely not in his idea of post-millennial, or the victory has happened now. Or if they see victory, it's about spiritual victory, it's about evangelism, things like that. It's not about political.
What's the difference between pre and post, just for our audience?
Oh, yeah. My basic definition is that in a premillennial society, the end of the world happens with persecution to Christians, and that Jesus would then come back, and then there'll be 1,000-year reign of Jesus. Post-millennial, it's kind of iffy, but that that we are promoting or creating that 1,000-year reign now, and that at some point when it's good enough, if you will, Jesus will come back and reign. So
And
the
Charlie Kirk is in the Post-Millennial?
yeah,
We
I'm
don't know?
Post-Millennial. Yeah.
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, keep going. Sorry.
Yeah. So the idea is one is it ends badly and one is it ends good, if you will, or victoriously. So he is suggesting the victorious thing because he wants people to act to gain electoral power or other power, and he's suggesting we should take back all these mountains. So go back to Jack Van Impe, right? He is in the pre-millennial, the world's going to end. But his idea of media and how we should use media and how we should talk about entertainment and how we should talk about the Bible as this urgency, that's exactly what Charlie Kirk is doing, just from a different theological perspective. And I think that Charlie Kirk understands his audience well enough to know that they are theologically with Jack Van Impe, but they want to be, if you will, with him, with Charlie Kirk. And he says that directly. There's a minority of people that agree with us, but there's a majority of people who agree with us in private, but won't say it in public. And I urge you to act publicly. And he is suggesting that they should do that. And when they do that, they will be victorious. The victory they talk about is not individual evangelistic or spiritual victory. It is about, I'll say, biblical victory, where the Bible becomes the Christian consensus in America.
So when you say like pre or post millennial, is that tied? Because like I'm not the religious one. Is that tied to like the rapture?
Yeah, right. So we think about the rapture as the moment where Christians are taken from the earth, right? Where there's no longer any of us here. And we think about the Left Behind movies where people are left behind and they have to see the fallout, the destruction, all things like that. That is a premillennial idea of the end of the world. In post-millennialism, there is no rapture. There's no taking away. There is a sudden, perhaps, or slow-moving victory where the Christians become the ruler, or the kingdom of God now appears both spiritually and physically on earth, and that's when Jesus will come back. Charlie Kirk is obviously not the first person to believe that. It had some legs or some roots in the social gospel, which Charlie Kirk is against. It has some legs in the history of America. At the same time, there's this, if you will, fundamentalist line about premillennial dispensationalism, and having some idea of what those two things are. I don't think a lot of people teach or read about dispensationalism anymore, but they have this idea, as you just said, there's a rapture and it happens. And of course, the Left Behind movies made it all that popular.
Yeah, I thank you for clarifying, because it's really important. Because I've got, let me see, I've got this book here. It's called How to Profit from the Coming Rapture, and I need to know exactly.
Big money, big money. Yeah.
Yes.
I need to adjust my business strategy, if they're doing something different now. So I am curious though about so at this summit, tons of pastors, faith leaders. What was your sense about their acceptance to what was being said, and
They were aiming, they were clapping, they were rallying. I mean, pastors can be a little not visually showing emotion, but they're wise. I heard a bunch of female voices going amen a lot. No, that you don't go to these things unless you already agree with them. Which is sort of he wants to expand his market, expand the people, but at the same time, the people they invited obviously had some attraction to it already.
Do you think a lot of the faith leaders or pastors he spoke to would understand what the Seven Mountain Mandate is?
I wouldn't think so. I mean, I do think it's out there, and I think there's polling on people that believe in it. It certainly has roots in the charismatics. It has made entrance, if you will, into the Southern Baptist Convention. There are people in it that believe it, but it's certainly a minority movement in the Southern Baptists. Outside of those two groups, no, I would not suggest that it is well known, which is one of the reasons for writing the book, is that I don't think people understand who Charlie Kirk is, but also I don't think they understand this broader strategy, that we say is fringe, but at the same time, there's someone who is appearing nightly on Fox News who is espousing it. It is not just unknown charismatic leaders.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I mean, I had never even really heard of it. And then I started hearing of it in the last, 5 years and through some guys here. And I mean, I had heard of the idea of seven mountains before, but I never heard of the seven mountain mandate in the same sense. And I never had a negative feeling about the
Okay.
seven mountains before. I
Yeah.
just kind of had heard, oh, yeah, I mean, that makes sense. You divide the culture, you want Christian influence, just like a Muslim would want
I mean, yeah,
Muslim
if you think about it, it
influence.
started a missionary organization with your Lauren
Yeah.
Cunningham, and he implemented it in his group. It became a thing throughout his, and so you go into a foreign culture and you want to figure out how best to spread the gospel. You look at these 7 areas. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's, there's nothing wrong with strategic,
Right.
planning and things like that. Even for Christians, I mean, there's a very, in my mind, the issue is not so much, hey, we want to get the message out there. We want to get people like exposed to the gospel, to be arguing for its truth, all that, and let it compete in the marketplace of ideas. The issue seems to be this kind of wholesale takeover, and then what, I guess. And
Right.
I mean, I could guess, but
Yeah.
my question is like things, let's say family, like a sphere of family. Like I have a traditional view of family. I always have, but I also now have friends and people I love that are in the LGBTQ community, and I'm much more sensitive to it, and I see it in a more complex way. And so now it's like, okay, so let's take something like the family. Like, how does this movement and mandate envision an ideal family unit? And what are they gonna, like, what are the implications for families that don't fit that mold that they have? Do we know? I mean, what is the end game necessarily, like in terms of legislation or in
Yeah.
terms of any of this stuff? I mean, I guess why should we be concerned about it? That it's like a nefarious kind of thing.
I think it's nefarious because it claims to be something that it's not. It claims to be an influence operation. It claims to be a Christians just want to be a part of their nation and influence their culture. It is not that. And specifically, this is a good example in the Mountain Family. We have both at the legislative, we'll say legal area, right? They want to overturn Obergefell, which, legalized gay marriage, and return us to a state where that was not accepted. And then also, Turning Point has taken action against certain people and try to target certain people, so people who are gay or gay marriage people, to make them feel that they should not participate in our culture. They want to silence those voices. So it is both a legal legislative action, but it is also a broader cultural action to only have that Christian consensus at play and to not hear from anyone else. And this applies both to, if you will, all the people you just mentioned, but also non-Christian religions. How do those religions fit into a Christian nationalism picture? We talk about Judeo-Christian, and it kind of silences the Judeo part. But also it is about having this consensus. So you can maybe make consensus with those people who share your moral values, but at the same time, Charlie Kirk mentions that with Jews and Muslims, but at the same time suggesting we should close our borders because of the invasion of different people. So I think that it's still unclear of what the end game is, other than silencing voices that don't agree with you, passing legislation to make that so, and then also suggesting that there is a historical mandate for this, that we should go back to what we were before. And I think that those three things connect well. And then the last thing I'll say is all the mountains are connected. So obviously the mountain of government influences the mountain family. And they will say the mountain of religion is the most important because you're trying to convince Christians to be in the other mountains. But they're all connected. And this is why Turning Point is really important, because they're doing all 7 at this time. So, there's been groups that done a couple of them, as I said before, but Turning Point is suggesting that we need all 7 of them. And I think if I remember correctly, I think it was Peter Wagner who said his goal, his dream was to conquer all 7 at the same time.
So so if I'm thinking about this, because again, what I want to do, so for a lot of my friends and even myself to hear, even an earlier version of myself, to hear that, hey, we want Christian takeover of these areas so that we can honor God, so that we can have a country that honors God. I wouldn't have seen that in an earlier version as an issue, like as an before in my life. And then, but I think what's created the issue, right, is the way in which it's applied, where essentially it'll be like, well, we're going to essentially have a theocracy kind of law, where if you're not Christian, again, either you're second class citizen or you are maybe deported, or something like along those lines. Or if you're homosexual, not only is it like you can't marry, we're revoking that sense of marriage. And even that, like, and I know this is controversial, but I go back and forth because I have a different view of marriage and I have a definition of marriage that I have internally. But then I would never want to say that a couple couldn't get together, they couldn't be together and make their life around each other. Like, I would never want anything to go that far, and yet it sounds like that's a real potential.
Yeah.
They can't even be in a contractual relationship with each other. They might have to hide their homosexuality or whatever it is. They might have to say, is that what we're talking about here? That it gets to the point where they are essentially criminalizing homosexuality and things like that once again?
I mean, there are many precedents they are aiming to overturn, and that surely could be one of them. And I want to say that, like, one of the themes throughout the me looking at the history of the Seven Mountains Mandate is they have consistently said we have compromised too much, and so we've lost too much. And so Charlie Kirk comes on the stage and is like, yeah, I'm not going to compromise. We're not going to be politically correct. And he grew up in the age of that, where, we threw that off. And so the idea is we're not going to compromise. And so you think about the origins of the Seven Mountains Mandate with R.J. Rushdoony and the Christian Reconstruction movement. It was about creating a Christian consensus based upon Old Testament laws. Whether he actually thought that was ever going to happen is up for debate. But Charlie says, okay, let's do it. And I think that the no compromise, and when we compromise, we lose, that is a Trumpian line, and always fight back, and all those lines. So it is coming to a head in such a way that all the things you just listed could be possible. And so I went to this pastor summit and I wanted to, the question answered, how would Charlie Kirk speak now that he's won? Right? Would he change his spiritual warfare battle plan strategy that happened in the campaign and years before that? Right? What would he say now that he's won? Oh, he didn't change anything. He said, we have so much more to do. We've won DC, we've won the presidency, and now we're going to go after the other 6 mountains. So yeah, all the things you just mentioned, I think could happen. He said, this country needs a 10 to 15 year exorcism. So what are they going to exercise out? All the things you just mentioned.
I'm curious about your strategy to talk about this stuff, because, I mean, Josh and I went to this summit for religious freedom, I guess last week. One of the things that one of my takeaways was, I mean, we attended some breakaway sessions and stuff, and it was great. Like, I learned a few things that I didn't know specifically about abortion and Supreme Court. But a lot of the other stuff was just like stuff we've talking to smart folks like you. And, we weren't really surprised. But we were surprised that there was no real in-depth conversations about Seven Mountain Mandate. I mean, I get it. It was a big tent. So, limited amount of speakers. But I think that experience kind of speaks to a broader issue that I know I have. Talking about this stuff, I mean, talking about Christian nationalism in of itself is just kind of like, do I really want to have this conversation? If somebody asks me, I'll tell them, but I'm not gonna lead a conversation with, Christian nationalism. And I don't even know how to get into a conversation about Seven Mountain Mandate. So like, what have you found has been helpful or productive to kind of at least navigate these kinds of conversations about Seven Mountain Mandate?
So I was sitting at that pastor summit, and I've gone to a couple turning point events, and I'm always in my head, like, would they recognize me? Do they care that I'm here? I had to register for this event, so they knew my name and they approved me going. So it's like, do they really care that much? And I bring that up because, I wanted to talk with people. I had plans to sit there and ask people questions about it, but I would come across as someone who was not supposed to be there, and I didn't want to be kicked out. And so it's kind of hard to talk to people about it unless you're, identifying yourself as someone on the outside. And so I guess what I'm getting at is it is not a thing people bring up in my area. It is not something that I've heard at the different churches that I've attended here in Georgia. But at the same time, if you take that as a strategy, Seven Mountains as a strategy, there are people talking about America as a Christian nation, and there are people talking about um, taking back certain areas, government being primarily ones. But I think at the same time, it's just like they're interested in their faith and their values being out there and being part of the conversation. And I think that many Christians are what's the word? Unsure about where to go. Just as you said, I'm not sure how far they want to take it or how far other people are willing to take it. And I think many of them are pushed away by groups by Turning Point. But at the same time, you had Gavin Newsom tell Charlie Kirk that Gavin Newsom's son is a fan of Charlie Kirk. So, I mean, there are people out there who are attracted to it and are attracted to what he's saying. And it I'm going to say opens the window, the Overton window, or opens the door to you talking about the Seven Mountain Mandate. It opens the door to what he wants you to say. And I think that takes time. But I don't necessarily have conversations in and around here about it, but I do see a distinction between the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship Church that I've been to and the Southern Baptist Church that I've attended in the past. And we'll just say the Free Chapel version of that. There is a distinction between those three, and you can tell it right away. They may not mention the phrase Seven Mountains, but you can tell exactly what they're for.
Like when you basically through the language of the preaching, is that kind of what you mean? Or just like through the language of the preaching and everyone, just the way that they talk, that you can tell that they're like, that they are all bought in on this idea of Seven Mountains?
Well, they wouldn't use the phrase Seven Mountains, but the idea of the sermon, not just the sermon preaching, but the titles and the topics they go to. I did a study back in 2016 about, I called it the Sunday after the Tuesday. So I looked at sermons that were preached the 5 days after the election. And I looked at a couple beforehand, and I couldn't find any at all that endorsed candidates. But I saw many that talked about, as you just said, voting for this particular thing or voting for this particular position. I heard a really good sermon from a pastor who, during the sermon, talked about going into the voting booth and not knowing what to do and not knowing what to choose. And it was really interesting. He didn't really say who he voted for, but the idea that he struggled was the idea there. I also heard a really good sermon from J.D. Greer in Raleigh. I think he literally, the days after the election, apologized to a bunch of people in his congregation, minority groups, immigrants, because he knew what had happened there in that election in 2016. So I think there's a wide range of, obviously, sermons that are being given on these different things. And I think that I listened to several sermons that are related to pastors in Turning Point USA, and they're talking about school boards. They're talking about American history. They'll bring in David Barton. They're talking about citizenship training. They do that a lot. So if you see those particular things, you know what church you're in.
That makes sense. What advice do you have for conservative pastors? I mean, I consider myself a conservative. I mean, I know because I didn't vote for Donald Trump and because I have compassion on LGBTQ people that I'm sure that to many people I'm woke and straight from the pit of hell. But I see myself as a pretty conservative pastor, and I voted Republican. I did not, vote for Donald Trump in the last few elections, but otherwise I basically voted Republican. And like for my Congress members and senators and stuff like that, and governor. But so I guess like my question is what advice do you have to offer for conservatives and pastors that find themselves like they love the conservative cause and they want to be able to bring that out in the marketplace of ideas, but they can't stand the populism, they can't stand the nationalism, they can't stand the
they're being pressured by
I mean, this Seven Mountain Mandate or this dominionism and taking over, like they find themselves very concerned. What advice do you have for them?
You know, I struggle with that myself because, you could double down on the weakness of Christianity. You could double down on serving the poor, and you can mention immigrants every now and then. And I think that would go over well with many people and to continue to do that. But I think because of the things you just mentioned, if you will, pressure from congregates or the idea that you have connections with this group, you just don't like other parts of the group, is that you have to then separate yourself from it. And so I think, I mean, we might use the phrase different way of doing politics, but that isn't what the church is supposed to be. So we could talk about that. I think I read, Michael Ware books a couple of times, and he talks about, de-escalating the importance of politics, not just in the church, but in America. Like Turning Point is interested in making every political election a national referendum on it and in the candidate. So de-escalating that. And I think, somebody mentioned this in terms of Easter the other day. It was like, obviously there's the weakness and the death and the cross, but there is also the life thing. And so one of the things I would say is that if you want to build life-giving stuff, if you want to leave a legacy, if you want to sustain stuff, this movement is not going to do that. They're not going to be monuments and statues 100 years from now, just as we have, church origin stones, built here in 1836. If you want to build something that is going to sustain life longer than the next election, Christianity is where it's at. It's not the populism or the nationalism that you said. And, that does end with, let the chips fall where they may nationally. I don't know if, that would go over well. But it's the idea that you got to find something, a positive declaration for Christianity. I don't know if the weakness of Christianity gets you there because we live in a society where that is not held up high. But if you want to talk about life-giving or sustaining life or legacy, I sort of go there because I think that some people who are, and it's going to stereotype, the grandfathers who are in the MAGA movement, if they want to get out of it, then that's what they're going to think about.
Yeah, they're gonna have to think about legacy. It's just, what I hear you saying is you're contextualizing to what people are what's gonna be effective from them to hear,
Yeah.
and ultimately, right? I mean, the way of Jesus is a way of sacrifice, and it's a way that he chose intentionally to live a life of surrender to the will of God and of sacrifice and loving the people that were marginalized. And I think that we are going to have to do a lot of hard work as a church, and I don't know how prepared we are for that. Michael, what gives you hope? Not Michael Matthew, sorry. What gives you hope? You said Michael Ware, and then that was in my head.
No.
Because we actually interviewed him.
Oh, great, yeah.
But what gives you hope moving forward?
Somebody asked me that question too, and I sighed. I can't think of anything. I do think that I won't say faithful living, but it's sort of the repetition of doing the same thing over and again, if you will, ritual. I think that the thing that gives me hope, because I've known other people that do rituals, and I'm a Thomas Merton fan, so that sort of monastic ritual appeals to me. But it's that doing those things again and again without the burden of effectiveness or success. I mean, we mentioned effective rhetoric, but we also should say those things because we should say those things, not necessarily because they're effective. And I think that doing the same thing again and again, because it matters, doing religious rituals, doing things like that, that is what, people build hope on. And hope is built on something. It's not just a feeling.
Yeah, I like that. How can people connect with you? Where is there a special place you want them to get the book?
Well, you can order it from the publisher, Westminster John Knox Press, with a 40% discount code. That's the number 7, the letter M, and cast, C-A-S-T, 7M cast, for 40% off at the publisher's website.
Nice.
Get it off of Amazon or any other bookseller that you got. I'm on Twitter, X, whatever you want to call it, at Matthew Boedy, M-A-T-T-H-E-W-B-O-E-D-Y. I do have an email from the university. You're welcome to email me, but I'm not going to give it out. You're going to have to go look it up.
You got to dig for like a normal
work. We're not going to spoon feed you here on Faithful Politics.
But
That's
I would just
awesome,
say
man.
the junk filter works really well here.
It does. I hear that. Well, Matthew, man, thank you so much for coming on the show, spending some time with us. It's enlightening every time we talk about this. It's just reminds me of how crucial this conversation really is.
Oh, yeah.
People really need to think about it.
Well, I'm glad somebody's reading the book.
Yeah, it's like if people if they want a country where essentially your brother or sister or your cousin or your friend who is gay or is working through, a gender identity or whatever, and they essentially might be at risk, then let's keep going down the same path. And
Right.
if we want something different, and I just bring that up because it's such a huge thing, man. It's anyway. I don't have to
When if they're
jump
not
on
willing
it
to
again,
talk
but
with you,
it's
then so if they're not willing to talk with you, you've already lost them. So
yeah. I mean, so I hope that we can take it seriously. And really appreciate your work, though, and bringing this to light. Thank you for doing that. And thanks for coming on the program.
anytime.
Absolutely. And to our friends and viewers, guys, thanks for joining us. Make sure you like, subscribe, share this with someone you feel like is going to benefit. We try to get you really quality stuff, thought-provoking material so that you can take this, you can wrestle with it, you can talk to people about it, you can share it so that we can start to spread these messages and these dialogues and conversations like fire, but a good fire, not the kinds that destroy everything, like the wildfires. So, guys, thank you for joining us again. And until next time, keep your conversations not right or left, but up. God bless.